Hey guys, this is Ernesto and welcome back to yet another Monday critique. I hope you guys are having a fantastic Monday. I'm having a wonderful Monday. So today we have two fantastic images to critique and I can't wait to get into it. So after this intro, we'll dive straight into these images. If you guys want to submit your image to be critiqued, please join our Facebook group. It's called Fine Art Photography and Modeling. In that group, I created a specific thread where you could submit your images to be critiqued. All right, guys, welcome back. So today we have an image that was submitted by this gentleman. Thank you very much, Alex, for submitting your image. Let's get straight into it. All right, guys, so now let's start out with light in this image. So from a lighting perspective, when Alex submitted this image, he did indicate that he utilized a speed light to help light the subject. Now, when I was looking at this image, I realized that I cannot really easily tell where the light direction is coming from in this image. But, you know, after diving into it a little bit more, I figured that the light is coming from camera right. I think that's where it's positioned, because if I look at where the shadow is falling on the subject, that's the only thing I could guess where the light is coming from. So that's what I think that where the light is coming from in this particular image. Also, you could tell in this image behind the subject that there was a nice little sun glistening off of the subject in the background. And I think you could have utilized that sun in this image a little bit more effectively, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more. So now let's talk about the light positioning and that sun in the background. So from a lighting perspective, the light in this image doesn't appear to be that good of a quality of light on the subject. And the reason I say that is that you could see some highlights here and there on the subject, like in the subject's forehead, the subject's knee. So the light is not exactly, you know, soft or is not hard intentionally. It's kind of like spotty in places. So what I would try to do in this particular scenario is, I think you utilize a softbox in this image. I'm not really sure how big that softbox was, but my suggestion is if you probably have maybe a larger softbox, or if it wasn't a larger softbox, maybe you could bring that softbox a little bit closer to the subject so that you can have a little bit of softer light. It seems like the softbox was a little bit away from the subject, and you know what they say with respect to the light source. If the light source is small and it's farther away from the subject, you'll get that kind of a harsh type lighting. So if you were to bring that light source a little bit closer to the subject, you would have a larger light source on your subject, and it would have created a softer light, and you wouldn't have like all this highlights here and there on the subject. So that's the only thing that's a little bit distracting to me from a lighting perspective. All right, so now let's talk about the second light source in this image, which is the sun, okay? So you could have utilized the sun more effectively in this image by simply positioning the subject so that the sun is, you know, adding a little bit of highlight on the subject's hair, shoulders, etc., to help add some separation between the subject and the background. I see this technique being utilized so often on multiple photographers utilize this techniques by saying, okay, you have your artificial light and then you have your natural light, the natural light being the sun in this case, and those two light sources you could help utilize to create a very dynamic image. So I think you're close, you're almost there, but I think if you push yourself a little bit more, you'll be able to utilize those two light sources, basically go out with one light and basically utilize the sun as your second light source to help, create that little dynamic image. I think overall, if you basically play with your light a little bit more, practice a little bit more with your light, just to try to get a little bit of a softer light source. What you don't want to see in images when you utilize an artificial light or even natural light is hot spots. You want to eliminate those hot spots as much as possible because you don't want to draw people's attention to it. So that's all I would say with respect to the light, and I hope that was helpful. All right, guys, now let's talk about the pose in this image. So from a posing perspective, overall, The pose is okay. I just think that there's one thing that we could have done just a little bit differently to help enhance the pose. But I guess I would say this. It all depends on what your message is with respect to what you're trying to portray to the viewers, right? So if you're trying to portray like a badass image, because the way the subject is dressed, that could probably be interpreted in that fashion. But if you're trying to create like a more sensual type of image, then, the pose would obviously help with either one, whichever message you're trying to deliver. So if I was photographing this image, the way I would have tried to take this pose is more of into a elegant type position as opposed to the position that she's in right now. So the one thing I would have done in this image from a posing perspective is simply this. Actually, there'd probably been two things that I would have done, but I'm not really sure how that would have looked because right now I can't envision it in my head. But the one thing that I always try to visualize when I'm photographing a subject is imagine that subject unclothed, if you would, right? And imagine the elements that would be exposed when you're taking that picture. And if you can imagine, particular components of a subject being exposed, you try to hide those particular elements by, coming up with a creative pose to try to help hide those. So what do I mean by that? So when I look at this subject, the way she's posed, if I was to imagine this subject unclothed, the first thing I would have focused on is that general area, the naughty bits basically. So when I'm photographing or posing someone, I try to visualize for the most part where it makes sense. Obviously, this is context, right? You have to always maintain context. So if you're trying to portray a particular message, obviously what I'm about to say may not be applicable. But for the most part, when you're trying to create like a more elegant type of image, you always try to do this. So what I tend to do is the leg that's closest to the camera, I tend to utilize that leg as the leg to hide, the naughty bits, if you would, right? So right now her right leg is down, and I would have positioned that right leg up. So that would have been the first thing I would have done. Now, again, like I said, is all about context. If you're trying to portray a badass image or whatever, maybe that particular suggestion may not be applicable. So just keep that in mind. The other thing I would have done, because again, if I'm aiming for an elegant type image, the other thing that I would have done is remove her hands from her face. And what I would have done is basically have her put her hands over her knees like this, just hanging it just like this, so that now the viewer could connect more with the subject's face, okay? As opposed to, hiding the face a little bit more. So from a poser perspective, those would be the two things I would have done to help adjust this image, just to make it a little bit more elegant. But again, if you're trying to make it a more badass image, there will be a different direction that you would go in. But from an elegant perspective, and the reason why I say elegant is because I saw some other images that you posted in this series in the Facebook group, and I see that you were trying to go for, that elegant pose. So that's where I would have taken this image if I was photographing it. So that's all I have to say with respect to the pose. I hope that was helpful. Let's move on. All right, guys, now let's move on to the composition in this image. So from a compositional perspective, I really, really like what you got going on here from a compositional perspective. There's one element that I really enjoy that you did here, and that is basically playing with the foreground elements in your shot and, your main subject and in the background. Having that foreground element in the shot just adds a little bit more depth and dimension to this image, which is awesome. So I really, really like that. The other thing that I noticed when I looked at this image is that the subject obviously is dead centered in your composition. So generally, for the most part, having your subject dead center, really doesn't work for most composition. Obviously, there was a previous critique, which I will link up here, that Carlos submitted, where his subject was dead centered in the composition, and it totally worked out fine. So with your composition, having the subject dead centered I don't really feel like it offers much to the image, right? So when you're taking such a composition, you have to basically say to yourself, what else is in the composition that will help enhance, your subject by putting that subject dead centered in the image. And given that you only have foliage around the subject, nothing really helps support that subject being in the middle of your composition. So what I would have done in this particular instance is probably have my subject not dead centered, but I would have my subject on the right side of the frame and just have some negative space on the left side of the frame, which is all that foliage in the background. I would have still maintained the lower composition that you still have, which is including, that foliage in the foreground, having that little foreground element out of focus, including that, and just having your subject on the right side of the frame. Now, by doing that, you would have also assisted yourself by creating that nice little soft light, because now you'll be able to bring that light source a little bit closer to your subject. And by bringing your light source a little bit closer to the subject, it would just make that light just a little bit softer as opposed to how it is right now, which is harsh. All right, that's all I have to say with respect to your composition in this image. And look, I really hope what I had to say today about your image was helpful. So now we'll move on to the next image. All right, guys, moving on to image number 2. So this image was submitted by this gentleman. Thank you very much, Mario, for submitting your image. Now let's dive into it. All right, so let's talk about the lighting in this image. So from a lighting perspective, I really like one of the light sources that you have going on here, right? So you have two light sources in this image, the sun and your artificial light, which is on camera left. So I really like what you did here with respect to the sun, utilizing the sun as a secondary light source to help add a little bit of separation between the subject and the background, and also adding that nice little hair light into the subject's hair. I really, really like that. With respect to the artificial light, which is on camera left, the artificial light, in my opinion, on this particular subject, I don't think is adding much to the subject from a lighting perspective. I don't think it's adding as much depth and dimension to the image as it should when you use an artificial light. And what I mean by that is that when I look at this image, the image appears to be just a little bit flat. When I look at an image, what I try to look for in my image or anybody's images is basically depth and dimension, okay? And what I mean by that is that I'm looking for that cheek to be chiseled by the shadow area of the subject. I'm looking for it to be chiseled out, right? And the way to do that is by positioning your light source in the correct area, and also by utilizing correct exposure on the light as well as your camera. So I think because your light source in the front, your artificial light, because that light is missing that little bit of depth and dimension, I just feel that's where the image falls a little bit flat. But I do like and I do love that fact that you have that light source, which is the sun, behind your subject. I think you utilize that nicely. I think going forward, I think you should probably just practice with this technique a little bit more, and do some more shots doing it. There's a lot of photographers out there that utilize this technique, and they utilize it consistently. I personally haven't really utilized this technique as much as I should. I probably should utilize it more, but it's very effective, especially when you don't have two lights to take with you. You can always have the sun as your secondary light source. So I think you're onto something really, really good here. So I think you should really, really continue to push at it, and I think you'll get better. So look, here's the thing. Me personally, I'm only at like 1% of where I need to be. I'm just scratching the surface, right? I get a lot of messages from you guys saying, you find my work inspirational and whatnot, and that's humbling. That's really humbling to me. It's flattering, humbling, all this great stuff. It's great. But I personally, when I look at my work, I say to myself, I'm only at 1% of where I need to be. I'm just scratching the surface, you know. And the way I'm gonna get to, you know, that other 99% that's missing is by practicing, you know, going out there, practicing my craft. It doesn't have to be photography, guys. It could be anything that you're trying to be, right? If you don't practice, you don't get there. If you want to be the best at what you want to be at, practice. It just doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen automatically. Practice, read up on books, you know, go to workshops, do tutorials. All these little elements help you with your growth. All right, so I'm off of my soapbox, back to action. So that's all I have to say with respect to your lighting. Just, you know, continue to practice this technique of yours. And I think when you continue to practice, I think we will have some awesome images coming from you, and probably we will come into you and ask you, look, tell us how you did that, you know? So practice, man. All right, moving on. All right, guys, now let's move on to the pose in this image. So from a posing perspective, overall, I really love what you got going on with the pose. There's just two things that I personally would have probably tried to adjust in this image to help enhance it a little bit. The first thing has to do with the helmet. Now, unless you were basically advertising for the helmet or you were trying to highlight the helmet or whatever, if you were trying to highlight the helmet, then including it in the shot makes total sense, right? However, if you weren't trying to highlight or showcase the helmet, what I would have done is eliminate the helmet so I could see more of the subject, okay? That would have been the first thing that I would have done, eliminate the helmet. So now you're probably asking yourself, so what do I do now with the subject's hands? So one of the things you could have done is you could have used her left hand to basically hanging off of the, you know, the handle rail, right? You could just have her hanging off of the handle rail just like this, okay? That's the one thing you could have done with the hand and eliminate that helmet. So the other thing that I noticed with the subject's head is that the head appears to be a little bit strained. Like if you look at her neck, is just a little bit strained. So here's what I would have done with respect to her neck position. I would just have her straighten up her neck just a little bit more and turn her head into your light, which is your light that you have positioned on camera left just a little bit more. And I think that would eliminate that strain that I see in the subject's neck. So those are the only two things that I would have done from a posing perspective to help enhance the subject just a little bit more. There is one more thing, and this one is more of a nitpicky thing, okay? So if you look at the front wheel of this image of the motorcycle, if you look at the motorcycle's front wheel, you will notice that there's just a little bit of the subject's toes or feet right in the front there. And this could have been eliminated either by having her move her, you know, feet back, or you could have just corrected it in post. And again, that's nitpicky. Sometimes I don't notice this stuff either. So if I had noticed it after the fact, I would have tried to clean that up in post. So those are the only things that I noticed with respect to your pose. Other than that, we'll move on. All right, guys, now let's move on to the composition in this image. So from a compositional perspective, yeah, that's what I had to say about that composition, which is nothing, because the composition is fine the way it is. So great job, man. Thank you very much for submitting your image. All right, guys, so now we are at that point where we're gonna rate these two images. So now let's get into the rating of these two images. Light. I gave this image a 3. Pose. I gave this image a 3. Composition. I gave this image a 2. Overall, this image received a rating of 2.66 out of 5. All right, guys, now let's get into image number 2. Light. I gave this image a 3. Pose. I gave this image a 3. Composition. I gave this image a 5. overall, this image received a rating of 3.66 out of 5. All right, guys, thank you so much for submitting your images. I hope what I had to say today was helpful to the image creators, and I hope it was helpful to you, the viewers, as well. Thank you so much for watching this Monday Critique video. I sincerely appreciate it. Guys, if you have any comments about what I had to say, please drop that down below. And if you have any comments about the image creators' images, please drop those down below. But please keep it positive and make sure that it's a constructive critique and not just, it's bad, good, or whatever. Just make sure you offer some commentary that it could help, the community and also the image creators. So again, thank you very much. That is it. Thank you very much for watching this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with your friends and family. And please put some feedback down below and let me know what you think about this video. And guys, if you got this far in the video, you must be enjoying this content and you must be enjoying this channel. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next Monday.